There you are.
All
Uh,
right.
I
Thank you,
don't see
Riane.
it.
Okay, everyone, please mute yourselves, except for Riane.
Not only the so-called public sphere, from which the majority of humanity have been barred in domination systems, what I call domination systems, uh, and also the whole of our prehistory, the whole of our history, including the millennia of what we call prehistory. And that led to The Chalice and the Blade, led to other books, including Sacred Pleasure, which, uh, because I introduced this partnership domination social scale in really in The Chalice and the Blade. That was the first book that brought that out. And then in Sacred Pleasure, I looked at how both sexuality and spirituality are very, very different. And everything else, politics, economics, it was really sort of a preview of things to come, depending on the degree to which a culture orients to either end of this social scale. And I wrote a book on education called Tomorrow's Children. I wrote a self-help book yet, but it's very different from most self-help books, although it won an award as the best self-help book of that year, The Power of Partnership, looking at how 7 key relationships are very different depending on how much we orient to either end of the partnership domination scale, how we relate to ourselves, to others, in our intimate relations, uh, in our work and community relations, but then going on to our national relations, international relations, how we relate to our Mother Earth, and our spiritual relations. And to just really fast forward fast, Nurturing Our Humanity is my latest. And that book takes into, I worked on it for over 10 years. And it shows how neuroscience, hard science, right, really verifies the conceptual frame of the partnership domination scale. And I'm going to stop here. I've
All right.
shared a lot with you.
All right. Well, I wanted to ask you some other things about. I mean, there are two areas we could go right now. One is to define maybe some of the places that are more oriented toward a partnership type of society and those that are more dominating types. And the other is to look at human nature. And you might want to do that first. We've had human nature described by a dominating framework. What is human nature? And what you're talking about in your books is new science, basically, what new science has shown us about the possibilities of human nature. We've been locked in a dominator definition of what human nature is. So how would you describe it?
Well, let me start with that because those are big questions, aren't they? Yes, we have been taught a story about human nature that actually justifies a top-down domination system. Whether it's original sin, whether it's selfish genes, it's the same story, isn't it? There's something wrong with us. So we need to be rigidly controlled from the top, whether it's by priests or whatever. And of course, that is very appropriate as a story about human nature. Um, and that story is perpetuated in so many ways. It starts really with um, the caveman cartoon, doesn't it? Because there he is. Uh, he's got a club, a weapon in one hand, and with the other hand, he's pulling a woman by the hair, right? So, what does it say? That uh, violence, domination, male dominance, that's just human nature, right? That's how it's always been. And by definition, then, that's how it always has to be. Well, the reality, and this is really all documented in very, I mean, the book is sort of 1/3 of it is citations. What can I say? It's really a fairly short book, Nurturing Our Humanity, and very accessible. I think you will sort of verify that, shows that actually that is a completely false picture of human nature, drawing evidence from neuroscience, for example, that guess what? Contrary to popular mythology, the so-called pleasure centers of our brains light up more when we share and care than when we win. Think about that for a moment. I mean, we're talking about brain scans, okay? And there are many other studies, but I'll just mention that one. But it's not only neuroscience, and not only biological sciences, but social science. We now know from both anthropology and from archaeology and from linguistics that actually for the vast majority of our human appearance on this earth, for the vast majority of our cultural evolution for millennia, when we lived in foraging societies, and then, as is detailed in the Chalice and the Blade and in Sacred Pleasure, even in early farming societies, our societies oriented more to the partnership side. And I can give you one example only. There's a town in Anatolia called Çatalhöyük, which is one of the largest Neolithic or early farming sites ever excavated. And this is what we see there. First, we see that there are no signs of destruction through warfare for 1,000 years. That's a long time, right? Secondly, we see that there is rather than these what I call hierarchies of domination, these top-down rankings, economic and social, familial, in family, because family is very important. What we find here in the grave goods, in the size of houses, are no signs of the kinds of inequalities we are so used to. And very important, because this is completely marginalized in what we're taught as important knowledge and truth, there are no signs of gender inequality in either the grave goods or even in studies of DNA. So we're really talking about something that transcends the old categories, aren't we? We're talking about a more partnership, not ideal, but more of a partnership orientation. So again, this whole notion of an innately flawed human nature that justifies domination systems is a fiction.
And we see that too with the work that Frans de Waal did and that you mentioned. He's a primatologist at Emory University, that showed the difference between the chimpanzee culture versus the bonobos.
It isn't only Frans de Waal, but Frans de Waal, by the way, wrote a wonderful book on empathy. And I love to quote him because he said, if empathy weren't part of, quote, human nature, evolution would never have equipped us for it. It would never have gotten into the empathy business. It is very much part of human nature, so much so, as I said, that studies, for example, show that people are actually happier when they give than when they win. It's really fascinating what science is really showing. But what Frans de Waal and others have, of course, we're always told about the chimpanzees as our closest primate relative, right? Well, the bonobo, which is another kind of chimpanzee, have the same DNA relationship to us as the common chimps. But are they different culturally? They are not as violent as the chimps. They are not male dominated. And they really have and this is in nurturing our humanity, their brains are actually different. And they're smarter, by the way. And like us, they uh, have sex not only for procreation, but for pleasure. So it's a society based on sharing of pleasure, be it food, be it sex, rather than the fear of pain, which is what domination systems are based on, as we very well know, whether it's economic pain, whether it's like in the European Middle Ages, which really looked a lot like the Taliban, if you think about it, with the Inquisition, the Crusades, the witch burnings, right? Women had no rights, nobody had any rights. Um, so we've moved towards the partnership side, but not enough. And this is what nurturing our humanity closes with, our four cornerstones that we need to build so that we don't keep having these regressions to domination like the one we're going through now.
With that, I wanted to bring up one of the four cornerstones. I know we're touching on all of them, but one of them is economics, which we're very interested in. And in that area, I think especially in Sacred Pleasure probably was the book that you showed, where caregiving is just not valued in our GDP, or it has no economic value. And what that value would look like if we gave it the same, if we gave it the same value we give other work. We don't count it. It's free. It's women's work. So talk about that.
Well, let me backtrack for a moment, because as you, I'm sure, are very well aware, the economic argument is still capitalism or socialism versus capitalism. And that, as a friend of and colleague of mine calls these kinds of arguments, in fact, as she calls all of the conventional social categories, weapons of mass distraction, okay? Because the truth of the matter is that, number one, capitalism and socialism both came out of early industrial times, the 1700s, the 1800s, and we're now in the 21st century post-industrial era. So on that count alone, they'd be antiquated, wouldn't they? But they also came out of more rigid domination times. So getting to your point, Georgia, for both Marx and for Smith, the work of caring for people, starting in childhood, caring for the sick, the elderly, etc., that was just women's work to be performed for free in a male-controlled household. So much so that as late as when Marx wrote, in most places that orient, to the domination side, a woman could not, so rigid was this orientation, that a woman could not even sue for injuries inflicted on her. Only her husband could sue for loss of her services. Okay, so we really have to understand that that their mentality was, that's just reproductive, not productive, right? And of course, what the COVID-19 pandemic has really revealed is that actually that's the most important work, isn't it? Mm-hmm. The most essential work is caring for people, health care, child care, food, providing us with food. It isn't all of this financial, nonsense, really. So in the book on economics that I wrote, The Real Wealth of Nations, I've proposed that what we need is to retain the partnership elements of both capitalism and socialism, because there are some, but move beyond both to recognize that the most important wealth, the real wealth, consists of the contributions of people and of nature. And so we need to care for them. We need economic systems that reward those activities. And that is our chance now, here is this time of the COVID epidemic. And a lot of people in bits and pieces are bringing this out, aren't they?
Indeed.
But what we need is that holistic frame and stop arguing. Of course, we need enlightened government policies. And yes, it would be nice if we had a free market. We don't happen to have one. I mean, trade is important, but not with mega fiefdoms, mega corporations controlling, the market. And we've been developing new metrics, new measures, and I really urge you to go to centerforpartnership.org and look for alternative metrics. Look for the social wealth index and the social wealth economic indicators, because we have the funding now to convert the indicators, all 24 of them, which is a lot of indicators, into one number like GDP, but very much unlike GDP, in that, as is needed actually for the post-industrial age, it focuses on where we are not only in terms of human well-being, but in terms of human capacity development, okay? And by that, I mean not only our capacity to be, quote, productive in the economy, but our capacity for consciousness, for caring, for creativity, which are what makes us human, really. So go to those, and because that's a tool for shifting economic thinking, to recognize what really is real wealth. And of course, it may not come as a surprise to many of you that we have had an economic system in both capitalist and socialist theory, in which caring for people, caring for nature, the so-called women's, keeping a clean and healthy home environment, which then translates into our planetary environment, right?
Mhm.
Has been devalued as soft, feminine, right? It's a gendered system of values. And it's as the status of women rises that we can change that, as happened in Northern European nations like Sweden, Finland, Norway, but that's another story.
You did mention, I think it was in The Real Wealth of Nations, you mentioned the exact amount of money at that time. I don't know what year that book came out.
Oh my
That,
goodness. Well, yes, and since then there have been other studies. There was an Australian study, and I'm so glad you brought that up, Georgia, an Australian study measuring the economic value, the dollar value, basically, of the work of caring in households. And they found that if it were included, it would constitute 50% of the reported Australian GDP. 50%. But think about it though, they use not just market value, which is very low. The women, and it is mostly women, and very often Latinas in the United States and African American women who do the direct care work, their wages are so low that so many of them have to be on welfare to survive. But it is also because they used another method called opportunity cost, which is averaging what the income would be in Australia, how much was lost by doing this work. And that, averaging those two, is what brought it up to 50%. Other studies only show 30%, which is still big, but they use only market value, which, as I said, we're talking about what do we value when we're talking economics, okay?
that's exactly right. What do we value? I think that's the major question that is never answered outside, or rarely answered outside of the dominator frame of reference. And that's what you're pushing, is getting us to the place where we ask this question from a different frame of reference, instead of the default mode we're in as a culture, and which is brings me to something that might be a little controversial, but I want to get your input on it. Um, a lot of liberals and even progressives will say, well, what they do to women in countries like Egypt, where there's genital mutilation, or some African nations, or how women are treated in some nations where they're really subjected much more than we're used to. They will say, well, that's their custom. We don't interfere. We don't make a judgment about it. I'd really like to hear your thoughts about this.
Well, I think there are such things as human rights standards, aren't they?
Yes.
And I think that in that sense, the postmodern cultural relativity conversation has been extremely reactionary. I know that it's considered, very hip and forward looking, but it's very reactionary because if there are no standards, anything goes. And since humans really do need standards, it's an invitation to go back to the old domination standards. And we know what those are. There's one set of rules for those who dominate, and another set of rules for those who are supposed to be dominated, whether it's women, whether it's so called inferior men, inferior races. I mean, so we're back to square one, aren't we, with this cultural relativity? So I think we all need to stand up and say no. And I have written extensively in this area. In fact, I wrote the first article in 1987 for the Human Rights Quarterly on what later became known as Women's Rights Are Human Rights. And in one of my most recent pieces for a Cambridge University Press book, which people don't read these books, they're so awfully expensive, but it's called Protecting the Majority of Humanity. And it's about women's and children's rights, and proposes that the Rome Statute, the Crimes Against Humanity international law, has to be reinterpreted or amended to include childhood and gender as protected categories, not just race and ethnicity.
Yes,
Because
this is
there
the
is a pandemic of violence against women and children worldwide, including here in the United States, of course.
Yes, I wanted to finish our portion on the human rights aspect of your work and what that means for, what things that we might work on, that we might be talking to our representatives about, because this kind of gets shoved under the rug. Human rights is looked at a big overview picture without looking at the particulars of what it really means. Instead of looking at a group in a particular country of refugees, we understand about that being human rights, but it's more difficult to focus on children's rights, which we don't hear about ever, and women's rights as well, to protect themselves.
And we are talking, I remind you, about the majority of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, doesn't it strike you as being weird, to put it
Indeed.
mildly?
Indeed.
I mean, but that's, if I have to say, we come by this thinking honestly. And this is especially true of many of us who consider ourselves progressives, who are more educated. Because if you think about so-called higher education, I mean, how much of it really dealt with women or children? What was taught to us as, quote, important knowledge and truth? Hardly anything. And out of about 600 years of so-called modern science, only the 50 years ago, I mean, consider 50 years ago, it's a second in our cultural evolution, did we even have women's studies and then men's studies and then gender studies and then queer studies, and they're still completely marginalized. I mean, just off someplace. And as for child development, the neuroscience that is so much at the core of my new book, Nurturing Our Humanity, that too, it's in an occasional course on uh, psychology, neuroscience. It should be part of sociology, economics, political science, because what we today know from neuroscience is that what children experience and observe shapes nothing less than how our brains develop. And with it, how we feel, how we think, how we vote, act, and what we consider important and valuable or not important and not valuable.
Yes, I think this is where we can probably open it up to questions. And again, I want to refer people to Nurturing Our Humanity, because this book really answers a lot and goes into more depth than we can go into in a short interview. But it's excellent, and I think you will get the information and the things to think about. This, you give us a lot to think about, Riane, and that's what I find the most exciting.
But
So
I want us not only to think about it, but to act on it.
absolutely. We have to think first, though.
Oh, well, I mean, if we talk about changing our consciousness, to me, it's what happened to me waking up from the domination trance, of
Yes.
just accepting
Yeah.
what passes for reality as reality when it isn't at all. I mean, what we consider economic externalities, when you think about it, those are the important things: the air we breathe, uh, the kind of care we get. I mean, so GDP includes as, quote, productive work. I mean, think about this for a moment. Activities that actually hurt and take life. And I'm not just talking about cigarettes, but fast foods, high fructose things. I mean, the the not only the manufacture and the sale of these items, but the resulting medical and funeral bills. They're great for GDP. They're all, pluses. At the same time, GDP gives no value whatsoever to the work of caring for people or caring for nature. So that a parent, mother or father, because more men, dispelling the old gender stereotypes, are beginning to diaper babies and feed babies and, do the hands-on caring and get endorphins, by the way, get chemical rewards of pleasure for it, because that's what we get when we even care for a pet, right? But these people who work from dawn to dusk, economists call them, in accordance with both capitalist and socialist theory, economically inactive. Whereas, as the social wealth economic indicators and the social wealth index shows, if we take a long-term view, which we have to, this is the most important investment a society can make: caring for people starting in early childhood and caring for nature. And that's the move towards partnerism.
Well said. We have a question from Nicole. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Where is Nicole?
I don't see her, but okay.
She just unmuted.
Hear me?
Yes, Nicole.
Okay, well, the question was, women's gender seems to be devalued even when it comes to privacy issues such as reproductive rights or even bathroom privacy rights. How can women's privacy rights be respected while not be considered impinging on transgender rights? How can we make everyone happy?
Well, first of all, I think that the notion that there is no such category as woman is erroneous. That doesn't mean that there are people whose sexual identity is fluid. Of course, there always have been, and there are. But really, looking at what happens to women in domination systems is very important to change the system. And as a matter of fact, think about it for a moment. It's the same people who want to, quote, return to a, quote, traditional, which is a code word, isn't it, for authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, authoritarian family, who are just go crazy when you say to them, oh, there are other possible gender identities, and that is a fluid thing. So to have trans people call straight people, heterosexual people, cis, I think that's a big mistake, because it, you know what it plays into? It plays into the old domination game of turning people against each other. There's an in-group and there's an out-group. So if you are transgender, the out-group is the cis. Why do that? I mean, why not recognize what is done to women, to girls, to children, like genital mutilation? I mean, read some of my books and you'll see the pandemic of violence against women and children. And it's the same people who want those rigid gender stereotypes and want to keep that in-group of mankind and the female other, that just go absolutely crazy about, you know, anybody suggesting that there is such a thing as a transgender category. This is not coincidental, and the real problem is we many of us, and this is true of the transgender community too, are working for the same thing. The environmental movement, the feminist movement, the trans movement, they're all trying to change one thing: traditions of domination. And once we get that straight, and we have the frame of the partnership nomination scale, then we can have a true powerful movement. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Riane. We have Tom Greco's next. You want to unmute Tom?
Where is Tom?
He's up there. I'm trying to unmute him, but I don't get a response from him.
Okay, you hear me now?
Yes. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Riane. Basically, what you say about we get more pleasure from sharing and caring, if that is the case, and I believe it is, then we are predisposed to behave in that way. And so I think it's not so much a problem of changing people's values, attitudes, or beliefs. I think there are probably the majority of people who are already there. The question is, what keeps this system in place? What are the mechanisms that allow those who are in charge of the dominator system to keep it going? And that's why I've focused most of my work over the last 40 years on looking at these structures of power and domination. And money, banking, finance, these have come to the fore in addition to military might. So we have the empire, which is trying to maintain order and control through all of these mechanisms. If the financial and monetary mechanisms don't work, then we'll send in the Marines or we'll send in the CIA to subvert progressive popular governments, as we've done all over the world for many, many decades. And so I think that's where the focus needs to be, is on how we go about changing the structures or circumventing these structures that keep power in place and move it back down to the lower levels, to people and communities and to cooperative groups.
Well, Tom, I think that my work has actually been about exactly that, but it goes much deeper, much, much deeper, and it connects the dots between what happens in families, in childhood, in gender and what happens in the political and economic, educational, religious, etc. spheres. And I want to tell you that it's not coincidental that the people pushing us back to what I call domination systems invariably also want us to either maintain or go back to this, quote, traditional family. Take Stalin in the former Soviet Union. It wasn't just Hitler who insisted on that kind of authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family. When Stalin came into power, what few steps there were to, they tried to sort of abolish the family, which you can't abolish the family, of course, it was nonsense. But he immediately, for him, abortion became a big thing again. Illegitimacy became a big thing. And his wife actually committed suicide because he was so much of a dominator in his relationship with her. If you look at Khomeini's Iran, at Stalin's Soviet Union, at the Taliban, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, and Southern, the rightist fundamentalist alliance in the United States, if we weren't so trained to marginalize the majority of humanity, women and children, it would jump at us that they connect the dots, because on the gut they know it. So let me just propose to you that when a child grows up, I mean, you mentioned empire and you mentioned progressive movements. Well, the Arab Spring was a progressive movement. And who did they end up by voting for? For a religious fundamentalist authoritarian regime, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is not coincidental that genital mutilation is a custom in Egypt, that the Egyptian family is the old dominator family. People, children, see, nurturing our humanity really explains this in detail. How it is that people, for example, in the United States, voted for Trump. Who were these people? Why did they follow lockstep, so many of them, their evangelical leaders? Why did they vote for a man who despises women? And by the way, one study showed that the one thing that Trump voters had in common more than anything else was their mistrust and hostility towards so-called uppity women, women who wanted to change that in-group of mankind and the out-group of the female other. And I want to say to you one last thing, and this is very important, and I go into it in detail in The Real Wealth of Nations, although I also mention it and talk about it in Nurturing Our Humanity. We are used to only thinking of economic injustice in the public sphere. But I would like to suggest to you that what happens in households is not only vital in terms of human rights, whether people respect or consider human rights violations as normal, I mean, obviously, if we know that what children experience and observe shapes their brains, right? We know that will, in the early years especially, that will have a huge impact. But you know that there are studies showing that in areas, in subcultures and cultures that are very much on the domination side, with these rigid gender stereotypes, where being a real man is not being like a woman, right? In other words, not being caring, not being compassionate, not being nonviolent. That if you analyze what happens in terms of resource distribution, it is a nightmare. One study showed that in Brazil, $1 in the hands of the mother was equivalent to $18 in the hands of the father. And it's not that men are bad. Women and men both internalize this system of values. And so these men think that it's just fine to spend their money on gambling, on drinking, on whoring, and not on their children. So if you're talking about economic injustice, and you're talking about starting with at the bottom, that's the bottom.
Well, it still comes down to a question of what do we do about it?
All right,
Now, the educational,
I've proposed 4 cornerstones,
Yeah, which are in the book.
which are in nurturing our humanity. Childhood, moving them from domination to partnership, and these are long-term. Look, if you really think of what do we do, there is so much happening that is part of really of a partnership movement, whether it's the feminist movement, whether it's the environmental movement, whether it's the anti-racism movement in the United States, whether it's the anti-nuclear movement. I mean, they're all really challenging traditions. One thing, the same thing, traditions of domination and violence. But we keep having regressions. And it's because we have not paid sufficient attention to 4 cornerstones that the regressives do pay attention to. Childhood, gender, because we do have a hidden system of gendered values where somehow there's always enough money, isn't there, for prisons, right? You know, the punitive male head of household, or for weapons and wars, you know, the hero, the dominator hero is killer. But somehow there isn't enough money for caring for children, for health care, for elder care. Isn't that weird? But we have to unpack the real bottom thing, economics, and an economics that goes beyond capitalism and socialism, which, as I said, both came out of the same domination framework. And yes, story and language. And I want to end with language because linguistic psychologists have long told us that the categories, and this is very true of social categories, provided by a culture channel our thinking, so that it's almost impossible to think of other possibilities. As long as we're stuck in right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, capitalist, socialist, we're stuck because none of these, I mean, there have been regressive, repressive regimes in all these categories, and these categories either marginalize or consider it natural that the majority of humanity, women and children, be subordinate. Consider that.
I want to go now to John has a question and then Jeremy. And I'm not sure if we'll have more time after that, but let's go to John first.
Yeah, so my question is actually about that. I sorry, I don't have my camera on, but
I see. I'm looking for you.
yeah, but I was gonna ask, do you think manufactured consent is more of a threat than malice arrived to, of one's own accord, or do you think that even manufactured consent, such as like the propaganda that led people to Trump, can be reversed? And then my second question is, sorry, it's more superfluous. What's your thoughts on the paradox of tolerance? Because that seems to be the biggest point of contention in liberal ideology, in my eyes. I mean, you want to be tolerant, but at some point you have to cut off tolerance for those who are intolerant. And
let's start with tolerance. I hate the word tolerance. It makes me think I'm going to tolerate you. No, it's empathy that we want, not tolerance. But what was the first part of your question again? Because when you said tolerance, I just sort of went, oh, that's part of the vocabulary we've been taught.
Okay, that makes sense. I was just asking if manufactured consent is more dangerous than malice arrived to of one's own accord, because digitized propaganda is becoming ever more prevalent and is having more of psychological backing to really get into the affecting people's minds. So I mean, is there hope to reverse that, propaganda? And
Well, first of all, I think they're both dangerous, but I would not call it propaganda. For me, the question is why? Why do people go for voting for a, quote, strongman leader who fans in-group versus out-group thinking, who despises women and the so-called feminine and soft? That is the question. Why are they susceptible to that? And these are the questions that Nurturing Our Humanity answers. And it has a great deal to do, not everything, with what happens in family relations as they are shaped and in turn shape cultures and subcultures that orient more to the partnership or domination side. I mean, just very simplistically, when we are children, we are totally dependent on our caregivers, right? But in domination systems, caring and coercion are conflated. And I'll repeat that. Caring and coercion are conflated. So what do children do with this? You can't just say you're causing me a lot of pain because you get more pain, right? So then your mind begins to do weird things. I mean, not only do we have less of the kinds of neurochemicals that center us, that gives us pleasure, etc. We're in a constant state of alertness and what have you. But what we learn is to deflect our pain into in-group versus out-group thinking. And so when a Trump comes and he says, I can solve everything. Oh, I'm used to that from my childhood, right? Because that's what my parents, they took care of me. I mean, yeah, they were mean, but look, I turned out okay, sort of. Then he's fanning, in-group versus out-group, racism, anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant. Well, that's familiar too, because I had to do that, didn't I? Because I couldn't possibly express my pain to the people who were causing it. I mean, there's much more to it, but listen, we have to address these issues, and that's why childhood is one of the cornerstones. And fortunately, we have, even the American Psychological Association came out with a statement saying not only is spanking children ineffective, they become more rebellious and become more bad, okay? But it is harmful. And not only physically, but psychologically. We have the knowledge today. We just have to pay more attention to that and not just say, well, yeah, that's nice, but the important thing is what's happening with us I mean, we're so used to thinking, like Tom said, of the things that happen that are in the newspaper, right? In the headlines, the empire, the this, the that. But it's what's underneath that we have to address. And I hope there's this. I just suggest you read Nurturing Our Humanity.
I suggest it to everybody too. Before I go to Jeremy, I just wanted to bring up one thing that John brought up about tolerance. I remember a book called The Critique of Pure Tolerance, which you're probably familiar with, that there are places you cannot tolerate, using that word in a sense of like Nazi Germany, or actions that cannot be acceptable. And that's what we're talking about when we mentioned the human rights idea of human rights and international human rights, is there are things that cannot be acceptable. And I know you agree with that.
I do. I just don't like the term tolerance because, right, as I said, it's like, oh, well, I tolerate you. It's like, what?
Right. Well, it's kind of a different way of looking at the word. But anyway, let's go to Jeremy now. Gonna unmute you. You have to unmute yourself too, I guess, Jeremy.
I don't hear a voice.
Jeremy?
Okay, I think I'm
There you
muted
are,
now.
Jeremy.
Able
Yes.
to hear me? Okay,
I
great.
can
Yeah,
hear you,
well,
I can see you.
yeah, thank you, Riane, for your work. And I certainly, I agree with George. I read your book, Nurturing Our Humanity, and I think it's really excellent and important book. So I would also recommend it to everyone too. And yeah, I'm curious as to your view, if you look like over the long-term trends, say over the last half a century or so, do you see mainstream culture moving further, like from more domination towards more partnership ways of being? And if so, I'm also curious, what do you think are the underlying forces that are causing that to happen? And how can we accelerate those? And I like, obviously the ideas you put are fundamental to that. But yeah, I'm just curious on your view on that.
Well, look, I think that yes, to your question, if you look at the European Middle Ages, and I sometimes say it as a joke that when I get depressed, I think of the European Middle Ages, because, with the Inquisition, the Crusades, the witch burnings, women had no rights, children had no rights, nobody had any rights. And as far as, any kind of change in a rigid hierarchy of domination, St. Augustine said, and I quote, that for anyone to consider changing their station in life, it's like a nose wanting to be an eye, okay? That was the wisdom of the day, and it was accepted. So we've moved, every single progressive social movement has challenged the same thing, a tradition of domination. But as I said, because we have left in place these four cornerstones to really be pushed back. I'm going to tell you something. Some years ago, I think it was in 2007, I wrote an op-ed for Alternate. And I said, look, there's something that we need to understand and learn from the people pushing us back. They have shifted the normative ideal of family back to a domination ideal. So much so that in a period of 10 years, when people were asked in the United States, is the father the master of the house? It jumped 10 points to agree. Remember the Promise Keepers? Maybe you're too young. But those of us who aren't, remember that they invested enormous resources and times. They came together to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment, by the way, the Rightist Fundamentalist Alliance, a women's issue. Consider for a moment, why would they do that? So we have left these foundations in place, and it is on those foundations that we've seen regression after regression. And yes, in times of rapid technological change, and we are certainly in such a time, and now on top of it, the COVID-19, I mean, look at all the people who are in denial about COVID-19. They're in denial about climate change. Denial is part of the adjustment to this early domination experience, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've got to have a holistic frame. That is what I'm saying, because we cannot connect the dots if we leave out the majority of humanity.
It's a really, really good point. Is there any last question that anyone has? Ken? This will be the last one.
Ken, we can't hear you.
You need to unmute your, there we go.
I just did, yeah. Right? I'm in a quandary about the people that I'm part of, the Jewish people, who call themselves progressives and liberals. Many do, and most of the ones I know do. But we seem to cherry pick who we're going to have compassion for, and who we're going to, example, a couple of years ago, there was a term around the internet, PET, PET. I'm not sorry, PEP, PEP, which was progressive except for Palestine. And now you don't see that term anymore for some reason. I'm not sure why. But the Jewish people in this country, especially, are always talking about the racism against Jews, about the anti-Semitism. And yet there's a whole country of Jewish people who have that in spades. Also, talking about mutilation, sexual mutilation, genital mutilation, the Jewish people have been doing that forever. I'm certainly a victim of it, and everybody I know, every guy that I know is. So how do you justify these things from people who speak the progressive language, and yet they don't play it out that way in many cases?
Well, let me say, first of all, I'm Jewish.
I know.
And I am a Zionist. And I'm going to tell you why.
Okay.
If you look at the history of Jews during the diaspora, without a country, it has been one massacre after another.
Right.
Now, I think that I do not agree with every policy of Israel, obviously. But on the other hand, I don't take such a black and white view of the Palestinian situation because, for one thing, the whole Palestinian refugee problem was created by the Arab world as a political weapon to destroy Israel. Every other refugee group has been assimilated, but they would not let these people in. They kept them in camps, and they became from a small, several thousand to millions now. But it is very difficult, and this I want to say to you, to make peace with the people, because I lived in Israel for a while, who every day you hear on the radio, we're going to throw you into the ocean, we're going to kill you. It is very difficult to make peace with the people who are sworn to your destruction. Now, I'm not making excuses for some of the suffering of the Palestinians, but a lot of that suffering is not due to Israel. It is due to their domination societies, whether it's the suffering under dictators, and the Palestinian Authority is just as much of a dictatorship as Hamas. They pay terrorists' families for killing children, Jewish children. I mean, it's not so simple. And I have to correct you on something, on genital mutilation. What is done to girls and what is done to boys, which is a snip, I'm not condoning it necessarily, but it is night and day. It is, we are desexing. You know what is done to girls in Egypt?
Yes.
Not only is the clitoris cut off, but the vagina is sewn together so that it has to be opened for sexual intercourse. It has to be opened for childbirth. Fistulas, horrible, horrible things come out of it. So I don't think that you should equate the two. Now, I think that another regime than Netanyahu can perhaps help the situation, but not as long as the Palestinian Authority and Hamas insist on the destruction and the repatriation of what are now millions that were only originally thousands. That is not possible.
And as
I appreciate your answer. I appreciate your answer.
Thank you.
But I don't totally agree with you, though. Thank you.
I don't expect you
But
to.
I wanted to just add on to what Riane was just saying about the genital mutilation, because I think it's really a critical piece. The difference, besides all the really horrible mutilation with no anesthetic, the girls have at the somewhere between the age of 10 and 13, is that they never will have sexual pleasure in their entire lives. And
That's
that
right.
is a huge difference between what happens to circumcision in boys and what.
And if you're worried about the suffering of the Palestinians, worry about the women, because the women and the children suffer terribly, because this is a domination culture. I mean, as much as I wish that Israel could make peace with its neighbors, it's very difficult to make peace with the people who consider women and anything associated with women, like caring, like nonviolence, inferior.
Then we have to go to Brooklyn and talk about the Hasidic Jews and how they treat women.
Well, but the Hasidic Jews,
Another thing.
but the Hasidic Jews.
Okay, it's another conversation.
We'll have another conversation.
They're fundamentalists, just like the
Exactly. I want to thank you, though. I want to thank you for everything you said today. I think it's brilliant, and I want to read your book.
Thank you.
Good. Well, this has been extraordinary, Riane. Yeah, it's good. We don't always agree on everything. We came to those places at the end here, but I think it's important that we have the discussions and hear each other's positions and reasons why we think the way we do and how we can open our minds to hear more. So I want to thank you so much, Riane. Do you have any closing remarks you want to tell us before we finish?
Well, I want to say, I see all of this thing about Israel and Palestine, and I absolutely agree with Nicole that fundamentalists from all religions are bad news, not only to women and children's rights, but to human rights and to any semblance of democracy. And democracy as just elections is a failure. I mean, as I said, in Egypt, or for the matter of the Palestinian Authority, they keep electing, or seemingly keep electing, corrupt dictators, really.
So do Israeli.
Yes, Netanyahu is, what can I say? He's not my favorite person, is what I need to say. And I think, but there has to be a way of making peace. And for there to be a way of making peace, you have to have an acceptance of the Jews to have their own nation. And it's such a tiny little sliver of land out of the whole Arab world. It's really ridiculous when you really think about it, that these millions now of refugees that were a creation of the Arab world haven't been absorbed.
But this is true of the New York Jews who went to Israel, too.
Hey, listen, I have nothing.
This could go on forever.
Fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, whether it's Jewish, Christian, Muslim, it's domination fundamentalism.
Right.
I mean, that's all it is. Well, what final words do I have? Because I don't want to get.
Let's get back to partnership.
Back to partnership. I think it would be, I will talk about Israel. Israel tried with Clinton's help, first with Carter's help, to make peace. And that would have been a partnership. But the conditions were such that it was not possible. So I hope that there will be peace, perhaps not in my lifetime, but sometime. But it isn't just a question of peace for me. It's a question of changing a culture, or it's changing those elements of the culture that perpetuate traditions of domination and violence. And whether
if I may say, they should teach that to the settlers also.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't disagree with you. But the point of it is that if we really want to have a culture in which human rights are accepted, that no longer has a domination economics, whether it was a Chinese emperor or an Arab sheik I mean, it's domination economics or trickle-down economics, which is a obscene. It's like feudalism, you know. You should content yourself with the scraps falling from the opulent tables of those on top, right? I mean, so if once we have this frame of the partnership domination scale, we can be more effective. And once we focus on those 4 cornerstones of childhood, gender, economics, but going beyond capitalism and socialism, and story and language, then we will have the foundations, not for an ideal world, but for a much better, more caring
Kind.
And I know it's possible because there are little outposts, you know, like I said, the Northern European nations, and they're not socialists. They have a very healthy market economy. And it's not because they're relatively small and homogeneous. There are lots of relatively small, homogeneous dominator nations. I mean, think about that. It's because they moved more to the partnership side. And childhood and gender were a very big part of that.
Indeed.
So that's what I want to leave you with. It's a complete frame.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
would like us to have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riane. I don't know how I can unmute everybody so we can show our appreciation to Riane.
Thank you so very much. It was wonderful.
Yay.
Thank you all. You're a lovely, lovely group. And
Thank you.
I always love to talk with Georgia. And
We will continue, Riane.
okay, well, goodbye.